When I moved here with all these dreams and having read all these books, I really thought I was leaving the United States. And then when I came here, I realized I wasn't leaving the United States. I was just coming to a overseas colony of the United States. I often describe growing up in the United States as being like a fish in a fishbowl. Everyone is looking in at you, but you can't see out. We import nothing culturally because the United States is self-sufficient culturally. It has everything you need within the country. It's like the rest of the world does not exist when you grow up there. They cannot imagine the United States as an adversary. That because they've grown up almost feeling like they're subconsciously part of the United States or in the outer colonies of an American empire, they can't think of the United States as an other. If the US took such a drastic action as to sanction Europe, the entire economy, the entire global economy would collapse. So it wouldn't make any sense. And yet the Trump administration keeps continually making these threats. And there is no way to explain it other than some kind of derangement. The culture wars have made American politics easily understandable or digestible to people because everything is now in that frame. The education system has failed people here completely because they haven't learned anything about the civics of their confederal level of governance. The percent of Europeans that view the United States as an ally versus the percent that view the United States as an adversary. Now, those are levels that used to be around 50% just a couple of years ago. The percent of Europeans that now think of the US as an ally is now 14%. That's China levels. So the European public now, as many people here think that China is a rival or adversary as the United States. We keep relying on this American security umbrella. In 4 years, I think Europe is screwed. But if we build European defense and we get those American soldiers out, we make Europe understand that it has to defend itself, it can't rely on these forces here, then I think we have a chance.
Hi, welcome to the next episode of Beyond the Bubble. If you haven't yet done so, please like and subscribe to our channels on different platforms, including on YouTube, Spotify, and LinkedIn. Today's guest is David Keating. He's a journalist and author and a commentator on political affairs, an American, Italian, Belgian citizen who has been living in Brussels for 2 decades. And with Dave, we discussed his new book, which is called The Owned Continent. And in that book, he outlines how Europe is extremely dependent on American financial, economic, military, and cultural exports, and also how Europe can find its own independence and how it can stand on its own feet when it comes to these areas. So it was a very far-reaching and very topical conversation, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Hi, Dave.
Hi.
Thanks for coming on the show. It's a real pleasure because you just released a book which is hopefully on the way to be a bestseller because it's a very important piece. It's called The Owned Continent. I'll put it in the camera. The Owned Continent, How to Free Europe from American Military, Economic, and Cultural Dependence. And it's probably the most timely book of our times. Very, very topical. So before we get into the contents of it and where it came from and what the key messages are, so say a few words about yourself, how you landed in Brussels.
Yeah, so I'm originally American. I grew up in the United States, moved to Europe in 2006, lived in London, Paris, Berlin, Prague, Zurich for a bit, now Brussels. Brussels, I've been here on and off for 15 years. I've been covering the EU as a journalist, used to be the editor of EuropeanVoice.com, which was a side publication of The Economist, later bought by Politico. And now I'm the Brussels correspondent for France 24, which is France's international TV news network. So I'm covering all of the EU things for them from here.
And I think all of these pieces from your path to Brussels are integrated into the book because the book starts with you starting in the US and having your coming of age, and then how you open your eyes towards European Union, which was a very different thing at the time. We're talking 20, 25, even 30 years ago.
Yeah, the prologue is quite personal. The rest of the book really isn't, but in the prologue, I really tell the story of why I came to Europe. And yeah, like you say, this was not an obvious thing to do back then. Most Americans had never heard of the European Union. I was one of them. Even though I was a European history major in university, we never learned about the European Union because for Americans, European history stopped in 1989. So even though I studied abroad in Prague, Czech Republic wasn't yet in the EU at that point, and like, nobody was talking about it around me. I was vaguely aware of its existence, but like a lot of Americans, I thought it was like a United Nations for Europe. I didn't really understand it. In 2005, I was living in Washington, D.C. I was covering the U.S. Congress for an NPR affiliate, and I read a book. I came across a book, Jeremy Rifkin's book, The European Dream, which was about kind of the emerging European Union as an emerging superpower.
That was which year?
That was 2005. So the book came out right before the French and Dutch rejection of the Constitution. So this book and another book by T.R. Reid called The United States of Europe, they were extremely optimistic. So they were really looking at the future of the EU based on all of the success that the EU had had over the previous decade. So, of course, the creation of the European Union in 1992, the successful accession of the Eastern EU, former Warsaw Pact countries, the successful introduction of the euro, the writing of this constitution, everything was looking up. And I was very uncomfortable at that time with the way the United States was going after 9/11. It was an extremely jingoistic, nationalistic atmosphere. I write in the book how it was incredible to me that with the mistake of the Iraq War, George W. Bush had still been reelected. There was just a lot of right-wing fervor in the United States, and I was worried about the direction of the country. And covering the U.S. Congress there in Washington, for me, was actually the final straw. I hated it. I saw a completely dysfunctional government.
Already done?
Yeah, I mean, then because, the United States, it's the oldest democracy in the world, and it's archaic. I mean, the governing structures are just not fit for this century. And that's what I saw up close and personal when I was working in Washington, that the Congress was just broken. The whole system is broken. But as Americans, we're practically taught that the Constitution was chiseled on tablets by Moses and handed down to us by God. I mean, we have such sacrosanct reverence for the Constitution that nobody could possibly even suggest changing it, right? And there's no hope of changing it with a civilian government, for sure, because of the partisan disagreement. So I really saw no future for the United States. I really saw it as an inevitable decay and kind of the best case scenario, a managed decline. And then I read these books about the European Union and saw something that could really match my values, match my hope for the world. And I thought that if the European Union could make itself become a third superpower to the United States and China in the 21st century, that was the best hope for the world. A lot of that came from the Iraq War and the disappointment there. I speak of how I lost a family member in that war, and family friend, I should say. And my feeling at the time was that if Europe had been strong, if the EU had a single foreign affairs chief like it does now, back then, maybe, just maybe, they could have stopped that war from happening. And so I thought, this is what I want to place my hope in. So I came to Europe. It was a bit of a journey because at the time I did not know yet that I was Italian. So I had to get a visa, and the easiest country to get a visa in as an American is the UK. So that's why London was my first port of call. But in order to do that, I had to cover a topic which I was not at all interested in, which was private equity investment.
Yeah. And then you actually learned about the possibility to dig up your Italian heritage and then get citizenship and make your life much easier to move around. I just want to come back for a second. So Jeremy Rifkin, if I recall correctly, it was around 2007, 2008. I was working for the Commission, European Commission, and I think it was him personally who came over to give a big presentation to a lot of staff where we were working on his book. So essentially summarizing his vision for the world and the kind of governance and government, if you will, that the European Union has put in place, and that has such a potential to be emulated in other places. So again, that was before the financial crisis hit, and that changed a lot of things as the other subsequent crises came along.
It did, yeah. Sometimes I think I was a bad luck charm for Europe because basically from the moment I got here, things started falling apart. I'm actually working on a new book, which is going to trace these 20 years of crisis from 2005 until currently 2025. I trace 8 crises, and I started with that constitutional crisis of 2005, but of course that was quickly followed by something.
With the German and French referendum.
Yes, French and Dutch referendum.
Sorry, Dutch, yeah.
And that was closely followed by the financial crisis, which was much bigger and much more noticeable for citizens. I think most European citizens don't even remember the EU constitution at this point, but they sure remember the financial crisis. And I was there, I was in London in the lead up to it. I saw so much excess in the financial markets and in the private equity world, especially. It really made me sick to my stomach, some of what I saw in London.
And at the time, UK was still an EU member.
Yes, yeah. It was funny because I thought I was moving to the European Union when I went to London, but I discovered pretty quickly they didn't, even at that time, consider themselves really part of it. I felt that I hadn't really moved to Europe. That's why eventually I made the jump to come here to Brussels. Against all my better wishes, I think I write in the book, I was not impressed with Brussels the first time I saw it, but I was kind of, in my mind, I was willing to make the sacrifice in order to come here and cover the European Union. In the end, I ended up really liking it, and I think this is a great place to live, but it's not immediately evident, I think. So it was, that was why I went to London in the first place, and why eventually I came to Brussels, because I wanted to really do the European thing properly, and in London I couldn't do that.
Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting perspective, because you coming from the US and knowing the US very well, having grown up there, but also having looked at it from as a reporter and having worked in Washington, and then you are here for quite a number of years, so you have a very good perspective of comparison. And one of your key components, or let's say the key messages in the book, is this very stark comparison of this strange connection, symbiotic, or, and again, I don't say it in a positive term, but interdependent, and we might as well call it abusive, the way you describe it, between the US and Europe, of how, because you say, well, the own continent, of how Europe is inherently tied to the US in so many ways. So that will be my first question to hear from you. What are those ties? How the US, by design or by fault or by negligence or by calculation, has such a control and impact on Europe? And then the other side of why Europe lets it and what Europe could do not to continue that way. So let's look at the first part as to what is that US control over Europe?
Yeah, it's funny because when I moved here with all these dreams and having read all these books, I really thought I was leaving the United States. And then when I came here, I realized I wasn't leaving the United States. I was just coming to a overseas colony of the United States. It was actually very disappointing to me how much American culture dominates Europeans' every lives, just from a basic level. You know, I mentioned I was a European history major in undergrad. I was always really obsessed with Europe, even as a kid, and I loved Europop, Eurodance. I loved Eurovision, just like all the things that Europe produces on its own. And even I did a homestay in high school in Germany, which was my first time in Europe, and that was 1996, I think, and then did the year in Prague later. And the sad thing is there was more of a genuine European culture back then than there is now. We've seen actually the homogenization of American culture over Europe grow more and more steadily over that time. It hasn't actually dissipated. Part of that, I think, was maybe in that time there was this Eurodance craze, which I really liked, which then kind of petered out in the mid-2000s. It's something I write about in the book, actually, why MTV Europe went away when it did, which is interesting timing, I think, with some musical trends that were happening then.
And how it fragmented international markets.
Exactly,
you mentioned that as well, right?
So, I mean, that was my first disappointment, and that was really why I wanted to start with the cultural section of the book. I think the military dependency has been explored a lot. now. I don't think it's been explored for a long time. This is a new thing that Europeans are waking up to. But the section where I really thought I could bring the most was cultural, because I think it's something that Europeans don't think about very much. In fact, it was the thing that inspired the book. It was a Substack post that I wrote on my Substack Gulfstream Blues back in May, where I wrote about how Europeans are so culturally dominated, and I took out all these statistics, which really, they kind of shocked me when I was actually researching it, but they definitely shocked my readers. For instance, 90% of movies shown in movie theaters in the Netherlands are from the United States. Only, I can't remember the exact figure, but something like 2 or 3% of music on the radio in the Netherlands is in Dutch, and the rest is overwhelmingly American or British.
I do wonder, or let's say I throw out that ball and see where you hit it, is why is it so important? So why is the cultural aspect, beyond how you spend your free time or what music to listen to in the supermarket or while you're jogging, why is that cultural component so consequential?
Yeah, this was the point I had to be really forceful on in the book, because I could understand a lot of people would say, well, so what? So what if we're watching a lot of American movies? That's where the movies come from, end of story. I think it's had a real psychological effect on Europeans, because we're seeing it play out right now in the past year, where I've noticed that in talking to people, both like policy people here in the Brussels bubble, but also normal people, whatever that means, outside the bubble all over Europe.
Maybe,
They
Anyways,
both
I won't
of them,
comment.
well, what they have, I don't know who the normal one is there, but both of them have the same affliction, that they cannot imagine the United States as an adversary. That because they've grown up almost feeling like they're subconsciously part of the United States or in the outer colonies of an American empire, they can't think of the United States as an other. It's almost like they think they're in the United States, not consciously, but the way they talk about it, it's as if they're there. And I always hear from Europeans, I'm from New York City area, and when I mention that, people say, they always feel obliged to say they love it. They don't need to tell me that. I hate it. But they all want to say, the first time I went there, I felt like I had already been there. I hear that so much. And the reason is because they grew up with seeing New York City on television and in movies, kind of being inundated by it. And I think that applies to the country as a whole. You start to feel more American than you do European, because your entire life is surrounded by America. And it's not just entertainment, it's also the news, which I also discuss in the book. You pick up any European newspaper, and like half of the stories are about America, but very few of the stories are going to be about the neighboring country. So Europeans know about American politics more than they know certainly about European politics, definitely about the politics of their neighboring European country, and sometimes even more than they know about the politics of their own country. And I think that's especially true for young people now, Gen Z, who are getting their news via TikTok, Instagram, which is mostly about American politics because it's sexier, and they're not getting any news actually about their national politics.
Is it a, so to say, problem or an issue of simple or simplified versus complex? So are people drawn more to the US and following US politics and all the things happening over there because it's somehow easier to understand, more accessible? Not just because of the language, but because the way it's presented. It's often good versus evil, A versus B, Republicans versus Democrats, all sort of these dichotomies happen to be the frame into which that's being fit. Whereas in Europe, you have many more parties, where you have much more diverse political views and the complexity, and it just takes much more effort to properly follow it. Is there something there? Or,
yeah, I think there's something to that in the way that the culture wars have made your American politics easily understandable or digestible to people because everything is now in that frame. So, it's that Europeans, they have the history of American politics. They grow up understanding American politics. So when you have a story about the Senate killed a bill with a filibuster because the Republicans filibustered it, everything about that sentence a European will understand. But if I say the European Council couldn't get a qualified majority for a bill that already passed the European Parliament, I've lost the vast majority of Europeans. Yeah. Because like I write about in the book, the education system has failed people here completely because they haven't learned anything about the civics of their confederal level of governance. But it's really because they have no frame of understanding for this stuff. It's not in movies, it's not in their television, it's not even in their newspapers. So how are they supposed to understand when I'm telling them something very important has just happened in the EU's legislature when they don't even know there is an EU legislature? And I think that's part of the problem. They have a framework for understanding America and American politics, but their education systems and their media has never given them that framework for understanding their own politics in Europe.
Yeah. So now we can talk a little bit about the other parts. Again, still kind of the first section of the book, which is the how should I put that? The diagnosis, saying what do we have here? And what we have there is you list different aspects of that dependency, or how the U.S. has such an immense influence in Europe. And then there is certainly the military part, there's the economic part, there is the financial/payment systems part, and others. So tell me more about what those are, or again, we're not gonna do spoilers here, because the book is very much worth reading, and it's very heavily researched and very profound information there. I would just like you to walk the listeners and viewers through what are those key components where the U.S. has that influence.
Yeah, so I divide the dependence into three pillars: cultural, economic, and military. We've talked about the cultural. Economic is another area that dominates Europeans' everyday lives, but they don't even think about it. They get up in the morning, they turn off their American-made phone on their alarm, they log on to their American email supplier, they log on to American social media, they use Uber to call cars, take them to work. Every time they make a payment during the day, they are using an American platform, almost certainly Visa, MasterCard, or PayPal. When they get home, they turn on Netflix. They're using a Windows operating system. Everything they're doing is American controlled, but that's just what they see. Then below that, which I also write about in the book, there's the economic infrastructure. And those are the things that were set up with the Bretton Woods system after World War II, when the global currency became the dollar, that all transactions in Europe were pegged basically to the dollar, not officially, but that the dollar provides this basis of the way the economy is run. That was kind of a concession that Europe had to make in exchange for receiving Marshall Plan funding, which was denominated in dollars. That underpinning of the US dollar is what enables the United States to take out so much debt, by the way, so the Europeans are helping the United States out with that. They could hurt the United States by not doing that, something that we'll get to in section 4. But yeah, every economic transaction that a European makes is America controlled. And the reason why that's dangerous is if Donald Trump decided to sanction Europe and turn off all of those economic systems, all of those pipelines for which our daily commerce depends, the European economy would collapse overnight. And this is something I think Europeans don't realize. They don't realize that these day-to-day transactions are enabled by America. And I use the example of the sanctions that have now been put on the ICC judges for putting the arrest warrant on Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, and also Francesca Albanese, who they didn't like her report about Gaza. So now they're under these sanctions, which means not just that they can't enter the United States, it also means that they can't use American companies. So they're being dropped from their email providers. They can't make credit card transactions. They can't open bank accounts. And think about, that's what the United States can do to one European. Think about what it can do to all Europeans. And also think about what Europe and the United States together just did to Russia. It's interesting, actually, because I was on a panel last week with the Spanish State Secretary for Foreign Affairs. And he made a very good point, which was, Europeans are very scared. I think there's been increasing coverage of this now that different municipal governments and companies are trying to get off the American platforms because of this risk, particularly governments and municipal associations. But do we really need to be as scared as this is leading? I think not, because if you think about how Russia bounced back from the U.S. sanctions, yes, the U.S. did exactly this to Russia, but necessity is the mother of invention. So Russia invented new ways to run the economy, and they're doing fine now. And a lot of that is because of oil and gas, but we have a lot of assets here in Europe that Russia does not have. So I think that it's something to be aware of, that the U.S. could kind of shut off our livelihoods at any moment. But it's also something that we need to think we have the ability and the imagination here in Europe to be able to quickly rectify that.
Yes, though you yourself write in the book where I think we have the components of that ability, but at the time of recording for sure, but probably for still a couple of years to come, it's definitely not immediate, but not even in a very near term, because we have been so reliant on all these systems and all these services and foundational technologies and exports that we never even thought about ever wanting to wean off these systems. And we haven't really put in a lot of effort to create our own.
Well, and the reason is no one has seen the need to. So we have these new payment systems that Christine Lagarde, the chief of the ECB, every council, she comes here to Brussels and she's like, you guys, we have to put together this European payments initiative. We have to do this. And the leaders are like, yeah. And the banks, we have this Wero system, which I write about in the book, which here in Belgium we've just switched on to. But no other countries have. So we have Wero, but I can't make transactions with anyone. This came up just in my book launch actually last week, that anyone not from Belgium, we couldn't do a Wero transaction.
This WERO, right?
WERO, because, for instance, people from the Netherlands isn't on it. Yeah. So we had, the only way was cash or a credit card transaction, which I'm not a store. I can't process that. So anyway, this is say that the tools are there, but no one's seen the urgency to do it because they think, well, why? Everything's fine. I use Visa, MasterCard. Why should I worry about it?
Let's go counterfactual. And let's suppose that the U.S. president is not who the U.S. president currently is. So it's not Trump. There's a Democrat, Biden or Kamala Harris or whoever it is. Let's say someone who's not so hostile, maybe is a strong word, though in increasing context seems to be justified, but someone who's not so skeptical / unsupportive of Europe. Would we still be in the same situation? Because there seems to be an ongoing trend, and I think you yourself also mentioned, and there are references even in the early Obama years, Europe was respected in many ways, and there were cooperation and constant dialogue, but not necessarily looked at the way Europeans looked at ourselves and the way we thought the U.S. looks at us, right? The whole perception or the understanding here was very different from what you would argue was the reality. So what I'm asking is it the way politics and events have turned out that led us here? Or should we have woken up many, many years ago and say, hey, we are too dependent, we are too exposed, we are too much trusting an ally who is way too pragmatic, if not more, but way too pragmatic about that relationship. It's not a love relationship, it's a pragmatic relationship. And by nature of pragmatic relationships, it can end.
Yeah, for sure, Europeans should have done something about this a long time ago. At the end of the book, I cite a European Council on Foreign Relations study that came out in 2009. The study is saying basically Barack Obama is begging Europeans to grow up, to realize that the United States is not going to be there forever for them. The Obama administration made this point to Europeans over and over, specifically on the military front, but Europeans didn't want to hear it. They just kind of plugged their ears and shut their eyes and didn't want to get any of that messaging. But on the point of how Europeans think of America, I have to say it's been comical to me in my 20 years on this continent how much Europeans think that Americans think about them. And I keep telling them, Americans don't give a blank about you. The only Americans who think about Europe are MAGA because they're weirdly obsessed with like the ethnic purity of Europe or whatever their obsession is. The most comical of countries for this is the United Kingdom, where, when I lived there in London, they kept talking about this special relationship. Every British person knows this term. No American person knows this term, even people who work in Washington. I remember those first years in London, I still had a lot of contacts in Washington who were working on the Hill, and we'd laugh about this special relationship thing. British politicians would go on visits to DC, and they would say the phrase special relationship 20 times in 5 minutes, and it just looked pathetic. And all of this looks pathetic. I mean, Europeans look pathetic when they're groveling to the United States, when they think that America cares about them, when they don't. It's like a distant father who doesn't really care, and Europe is desperately trying to do everything they can to make him pay attention to them. And now stop abusing them, which the current father is doing.
Yeah, and you know, that's a very interesting thing. We're onto something here where this is not widely understood, I believe. It indeed that from this place and this continent, it looks very different from when you are in Washington, D.C. and look back and see that, because a lot of attention goes to China, a lot of attention goes to the Middle East, a lot of attention goes to all parts of the world, and Europe is one of them. But it's not the, let's say, the golden child, or whatever, the first among equals, as we would want to believe, given the civilizational achievements we have, the cradle of democracy here, and all the many things that we have. And again, we haven't talked about economics, but again, the perception that we're trying to analyze.
Yeah, I think there's two different things. So there's the foreign policy plans, and then there's the so-called cultural connections, which people think that there are. So on foreign policy plans, obviously the Obama administration made a big thing about the pivot to Asia. When we're talking about, like foreign policy wonks, the blob in DC, yeah, their attention has been going away from Europe for a very long time and focusing more on China, focusing more on the Middle East. Why? Because they kind of took Europe for granted, that it would always be there as a staging post for American military operations, that they'd kind of always go along with whatever the U.S. says, and Europeans have given them no reason to think otherwise. But then there's the average person, and I think that's what's not understood. The average American, they don't know anything about China, the Middle East, or Europe. I often describe growing up in the United States as being like a fish in a fishbowl. Everyone is looking in at you, but you can't see out. We import nothing culturally because the United States is self-sufficient culturally. It has everything you need within the country. It has everything you need to visit. I mean, I think, 5% of Americans have a passport. Only very wealthy people have ever left the country to visit Europe, for instance. You have every climate you would want. If you want to go skiing in the United States, you go skiing. If you want to go to the beach, you go to Florida. But also you have every type of entertainment you would want. It's like the rest of the world does not exist when you grow up there, which is a problem because Europe and the world have entrusted these people to make decisions about the world order. So Europe is dependent on these people voting in these elections every 4 years for the presidency, every 2 years for the Congress, who know nothing about the world. And this is an incredible lapse of judgment, in my opinion.
Complacency.
It's a complacency, but I think it's because Europeans do not understand how little America knows about them or cares about them. And why should they? This isn't Americans' problem. I mean, it's not, Americans aren't stupid because they don't travel to France. They can't afford it. It's very far away. I mean, I'm not going to give British people credit for being more sophisticated because they go on holiday to Malaga in Spain. I mean, that's their Florida. It's not that Americans are stupider than Europeans. It's that the geographic situation makes them very isolated. And if you were going to pick any people in the world that you would think should be running the world, Americans would be among the last people you would pick because of this geographic isolation that they have. I think if you were going to pick any people that should be kind of ruling over a world order, or administering at least, I think you would pick Europeans.
Would you?
I would certainly pick
the
Europeans.
Swiss, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, because they're much more worldly, they're more exposed, they're more they're more connected to the world than Americans are. There is that foreign policy blob. There's the people that Europeans, especially here in Brussels, are most used to interacting with are people like me, or wealthy Americans who are coming here to visit, well-educated. And they're making the mistake of thinking all Americans are like that. But they're not. The vast majority of Americans don't care about world affairs. They care about making it to the end of the month. They care about putting food on the table. And why should they? Why should they care about Europeans?
I'm just wondering out loud here, that might be true, or likely true for most Europeans as well, because they, again, by and large, on a larger scale, not necessarily those who are active in politics or active in other parts. Though here,
Well, I would say Europeans do care about at least Americans because they know
that they do, yes.
that what happens in America has a huge impact here. But also they care because that's their TVs, that what they're watching on TV, what they're watching in the movies. They care a lot about Americans.
That's where the culture
and other
comes
parts
back.
of the world too. Yeah, I think Americans and Europeans are very different in this respect.
So
and I think
asymmetric.
it's situational. It's not biological or something. It's simply that situationally Americans don't need to care about the rest of the world, and Europeans really do.
So it's very asymmetric. And I want to come back to one angle. We talked about economy a bit, but we can talk a little more. So you take the European Union, and you take currently 27 member states and a 450 million market. So it's a very important single market with a lot of flaws, but still it's an important single market. So if only for that reason, the European Union matters enormously. So how do you see that? And especially we can talk current politics, probably we should, is that we look at the culture wars. We look at a lot of for immigration issues and a lot of hot topics. But for the single market, the EU, I would assume, is still extremely valuable. So what's the interest in attacking it and pushing it to the brink and removing a lot of support or imposing a lot of tariffs and all the rest, while this market is presumably extremely important for American companies to sell to?
It's lunacy. There is no strategic interest in what's happening. This is kind of one mentally unwell man at the top who is surrounded by ideologues who have a vision of a new world order that does not involve a powerful Europe. It is hard to understand the motivations of these Project 2025 people that are now surrounding Trump in the second term. A lot of them are counterintuitive. A lot of what they say contradicts other things that they've said. It does seem to be a bit out of control and chaotic, and it is hard to discern a rational actors out of any of them. But you're right that it does not make sense for the United States to alienate Europe for multiple reasons. One is, the example we were talking about before, if the U.S. were to sanction Europe, that's a mutually assured destruction scenario because this is a huge market. And if Europe if Europe had a coordinated sell-off of American bonds, if Europe put tariffs on U.S. services, for which there is a huge trade deficit, if Europe took out the anti-coercion instrument, there are so many things that Europe could do to blow up the whole system, which if the U.S. took such a drastic action as to sanction Europe, the entire economy, the entire global economy would collapse. So it wouldn't make any sense. And yet the Trump administration keeps continually making these threats. And there is no way to explain it other than some kind of derangement. If you look at the national security strategy that came out in December, it is obsessed with Europe's ethnic makeup. These are white nationalists who view Europe as kind of the spiritual home of whiteness, and they think that Europe is being tainted by having immigration. And their obsession with that topic seems to be overpowering any rational strategic goals. Also, if you look at the military thing, they keep talking about, let's pull out of Europe, let's stop protecting Europe. I would like to see the United States project its global power without the 80 or so U.S. bases that are on this continent, and the 100,000 U.S. troops that are here occupying European soil. I'd like to see them try it. And if they say they want to pull out those troops and bases, I say we should call their bluff because they don't want to pull those bases out. The United States relies on its military foothold in Europe to conduct its operations around the world, most specifically in the Middle East. Even with whatever's about to happen with Iran over the next weeks, I'd like to see the U.S. pull that off without their foothold in Europe.
I think even Meloni, the Italian prime minister, so she was kind of flaunting the idea of U.S. troops in Italy may not be so welcome.
So no, she was making the opposite point. I've seen this go around on the internet. She was mocking people who say that. So actually,
I heard it secondhand. So
no, it's wild how this went around. Yeah, I saw this shared everywhere with people thinking that she was saying the opposite of what she was saying, which tells you that Europeans are ready to have this conversation, right? Because so a reporter asked her, what should we do about the American threats, basically?
Right.
And she was mocking this kind of straw man argument by saying, well, what should we do? Should we close all the US bases? Should we storm McDonald's? Basically, like, you idiots, how could you even think that was possible? And yet, look how many people shared that video thinking that she was actually making that point. That went viral across Europe. So her point was like...
I saw the transcript of it in a mailing list with the friends
I have to
shared.
say, the first time I saw it, I was also confused, and I had to ask an Italian, like, wait, what exactly happened there? But what that shows is she was completely wrong, because she was trying to say that such suggestions as closing US bases are so ridiculous that you're an idiot if you even suggest it.
Right.
And yet look how that went around across Europe, with millions of Europeans agreeing with that sentiment. So she proved herself wrong with that going viral.
Yeah, it probably is not workable, at least definitely not in the short term. But again, like you say, the very idea has been put out there, even if in a different context or the exact opposite context, but the very idea being even uttered, even pronounced, it shows something.
I mean, I don't think it's not workable. These U.S. bases operate with the permission of the host governments, right, under agreements that go back to the post-war period. Some of them are under NATO framework agreements, and some of them are under bilateral agreements with the U.S. Those agreements are renewed from time to time, but my understanding is, especially the bilateral ones, can be canceled like with no notice. Now, yeah, that would be logistically. You take a huge base like Ramstein in Germany. I don't think you can close that overnight. But you can certainly make it clear to the Americans. Again, I think we need to call their bluff here, because they keep threatening to leave. And it's like, don't threaten us with a good time. They're not going to leave voluntarily. And they need to be told, if you keep threatening us, be it with tariffs or with military invasions of EU member state territory, we're going to kick you out. And we can do that. Americans don't own this soil. None of it. They are all there through agreements with the host country.
It just makes no
sense. Make them leave.
Sorry to interrupt, but I was just going to say it makes no sense to kick them out. Why? But then let's talk like adults, right? Like to say, hey, you're here for a reason. This is the cooperation. Here's the framework. We can renegotiate it, but let's not play games here.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's exactly it. I mean, I think in the long term it does make sense to kick them out, actually. Now, this would leave Europe incredibly vulnerable in an interim period of, I would say, about 3 years. Other people would say 5 years. If, let's say, NATO unravels and the status of forces agreements unravels and all these American troops have to leave Europe. If Russia invades at that moment, we are effed, right? And we know that. But is Russia ready to invade the European Union in the next 3 years after getting just totally clobbered by Ukraine? I mean, they are depleted. They will need some time to rebuild. Let's say Russia wins the Ukraine war tomorrow. Ukraine is forced to surrender. Russia gets Donbass. It gets everything it wants. Even in that case, Russia is not then going to, the next day, invade the Baltics. I just don't see that happening. I know that Mark Rutte keeps saying that it'll happen.
The NATO Secretary General.
But if you look at Russia's military capabilities today, I don't think that's likely. And we don't know the outcome if Russia invaded the next day and the U.S. didn't defend Europe. It's probably not good, but it's not for sure that Russia would win that. What is for sure is if Russia has 3-4 years to rebuild and Europe is still depending on the American safety net, the American military umbrella, while just spending more but not having actually developed any European command and control, which is Mark Rutte's plan, then Russia takes us. I mean, if in 4 years we have not developed an independent European military capacity, which Rutte scolds people for even talking about, and the U.S. doesn't honor its Article 5 commitment, which to me seems pretty likely, not just because of Trump, but because the people I know in the United States will not be willing to fight for Europe. Absolutely not. And I have family members in the military. Then Europe loses. So in that Rutte plan, where we keep the U.S. soldiers here, where we keep relying on this American security umbrella, in 4 years, I think Europe is screwed. But if we build European defense and we get those American soldiers out, we make Europe understand that it has to defend itself, it can't rely on these forces here, then I think we have a chance.
Okay, there's a lot there. Certainly the timeline, I would challenge that, or not so much challenge it, but I just find it way too optimistic. I wish you were right, but within 4 years, it's enormous what that would mean, not only in terms of how to coordinate armies, how to create a European army, or at least have a central command where it's being properly done, the interoperability of the different systems. Now, of course, Europe's enormous exposure, and it's right in your book, to American military equipment, weapons, and all the rest, which are remotely controlled in many ways. So not only having the physical device, but the software part can be basically the kill switch, and to say, okay, you cannot shoot that far, you cannot operate this machine or this airplane or whatnot unless it's approved in Washington. So there are just so many variables to it. And I wish you were right. And I wish I could say, well, yeah, I share your optimism. And that it kind of brings me to the next question. Do you see the current European countries, leadership, politicians, and also here in Brussels with the civil servants all the way up to the highest levels, would they be capable of pulling off such a thing in such a short time with such efficiency?
With the current leaders we have, probably not. We do not have an impressive array of leaders here in Europe right now. I think that's an understatement. But I would say the biggest problem is that our leaders don't have the courage or the imagination to use the tools that we do have in Europe. And on the subject of whether Europe can build this command and control structure, there's no need necessarily to reinvent the wheel. We have something like that with NATO. I think the United States pulling out of NATO would be the best thing that could happen to Europe in the long term.
Tough love.
Because it would force Europe to very quickly switch NATO to being a European alliance rather than an American protectorate. The systems are there. And when we talk about an EU army, we're not really talking about an army like the French army or the German army. What we're talking about is more something like the U.S. National Guard. So in the United States, I think this is something most Europeans aren't aware of, but each state has its own military. Now, those militaries are under the command of the governor of the state. We're seeing that creep into the news right now because of Trump's abuse of the system. But you can see the president can command the National Guard. So I have family members also in the National Guard. They are deployed to Iraq. They are deployed to national missions because the governor is okay with it. Now, the president can override those governors, as we've seen attempts to do over the past months, but that can only be done in specific circumstances. All of this is to say, the way the National Guard works is that there are still state militaries that are coordinated at federal level with involvement of the national governors who can be overridden in extreme circumstances. That's what we're talking about with an EU army. Because there's the different languages of Europe, there's the different military traditions. It would be foolish to think we can have one federal army, but you can have a coordination of national militaries, which already kind of exists at NATO, although we're really talking about something that would need to be more controlled, have a more strict command and control structure. Not something treaty bound, because NATO is still a treaty organization, but you would need something stronger than that.
How about weaponry? Because, people are somewhat, again, compared to the weaponry, easier to coordinate or easier to do that, which doesn't mean it's easy, but just easier. But what about really high-tech equipment, from drones all the way to armed vehicles and all the rest?
Yeah, this is a
Armored
disaster.
vehicles, yeah.
This is a disaster of Europe's own making here, that we have such poor production capacity in Europe. Although, it's not as bad as some people think. But the biggest problem is that the various defense companies in Europe are making weapon systems that are not compatible with each other. And the irony is the biggest reason that so many European governments are buying American weapons rather than European weapons is that they know if they all buy American weapons, they're all compatible with each other because it's one system. And if they buy European, there's a risk that the different systems are incompatible. So we have to address that. We have to address the compatibility issue, which is insane. It is, in my mind, absolutely unforgivable that national governments have allowed this to happen. It's crazy to me that they're making incompatible military systems here.
They don't trust each other.
Yeah, I mean, that is the overall problem, right? So you have to ramp up production capacity that is hugely, hugely essential, and you won't get that unless you follow the French, advice here, which is that you can only spend EU money on European military equipment. We're not going to get there just out of goodwill. We're not going to bump up European production capacity unless you say that governments can only buy European. It's the only way to do it. And yet, Germany and Eastern Europe are resisting that call.
How do you see public opinion in this? Have you seen polls, or are you aware of any surveys where what do the French, the Polish, the Bulgarian, whichever member state we're looking at, what do they think about these plans? Is it more of an elitist view that you say, okay, we got to do this, this is the only way, we see the way forward, but those pesky voters are just not on board, or they are?
So historically, that was the case. The problem is you kind of had, let's say, elites with their eyes open, and the common people in Europe, that's a horrible term, I don't know, the normal people in Europe.
Voters.
The voters, yeah.
The electorate, yeah.
Not really aware of their degree of American dependence, the dangers of the situation. But I think that's flipped in the past year. Now you have European citizens getting it, and their leaders either not getting it or too scared to do anything about it and kind of trapped in inertia. And a couple of surveys have come out recently showing that this may be the case. There was a European Council on Foreign Relations survey that looked at the percent of Europeans that view the United States as an ally versus the percent that view the United States as an adversary. Now, those are levels that used to be around 50% just a couple of years ago. The percent of Europeans that now think of the U.S. as an ally is now 14%. That's a pan-European number. And then when you look at the percent for adversary, I believe it's as a rival or adversary together, 26%. That's China levels. So the European public now, as many people here think that China is a rival or adversary as the United States. That's something. That is certainly not reflected in the rhetoric of our national politicians. So let's think about why that is, right? Why are they not reflecting the public opinion of their voters? In Italy, there was a survey that just came out in January that found that, I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but something like 60% of Italians want the EU to federalize, the dreaded F word that our politicians are so afraid of using. Then I think it was something like 24% think the EU should be disbanded entirely. And only 4% of Italians think the EU should stay the way it is, which is basically the default position of all our leaders. I mean, they don't want to have treaty change. They don't want to change the way the European Council works. They don't want to do anything. 4% of their citizens support that. So I think that our leaders are not responding to the concerns of citizens. But you allude to the fact that there is a big West-East divide here, and I'm very aware of that. Eastern EU member states still don't trust Western Europeans. They still trust America more than they trust Western Europe. I personally think that's crazy. I think that's based on old stereotypes that are 80 years old. I don't think that's rational thinking. But I hear it when I'm in the eastern part of the EU. I hear it all the time. They really don't like the French in particular. But it doesn't matter what Trump does or says, you cannot take that Ronald Reagan part of their hearts out. I mean, they really, this is, if we can do it, the hardest place to have this divorce will be in the Eastern EU member states.
So now we are in the territory of basically the second part of your book, which is how to do it. And that it is the big thing, because what you're describing here and what we're discussing mostly in military terms and decoupling or completely separating, and you use the word divorce, these very heavy loaded terms of really basically not ending the relationship, but putting it on very different footing. And you do outline a couple of steps how that can be done. And I think the number one issue here is the timeline, because there's still the hope that this relationship alliance can be saved, and there is this desire that it's going to work out. And you also say that many of the leaders are cowardish, or they are very still not taking the issue too seriously. But perhaps they are just very pragmatic, and be the devil's advocate and say they're just very pragmatic because they understand the level of dependency that you described, the level of exposure to the U.S. that we currently have, and it's almost impossible to do it from one day to the next. And they say, well, let's not make it even worse because there's just so many ways an American administration can harm Europe if it wants to. So what's the way? What's that transition time that you mentioned, say, for military 4 years, for other things it could be shorter, longer, but it feels a little bit that you cannot jump over a chasm with two small jumps, right? Like you need to have a big jump. And is Europe going to live up to that, or is it determined to have that moonshot, as they would call it in the startup world, or from the Kennedy going to the moon moment? Do you think that Europe needs that to say, hey, the house is on fire, things are very serious, this is not going to get better, even if it's a very different administration in the White House? We need to take it as seriously as if our life depends on it, because actually it does. So here's what we need to do. Versus, let's try and find pragmatic ways of muddling through and minimize the damage.
Well, pragmatic is the word always used to describe Mark Rutte. This is the Mark Rutte approach. But we've seen that approach fail over the past year, I would say. I mean, yes, there are real concerns here. I won't belittle them. I spell them out in the book. Europe is much more dependent on the United States than most citizens realize. And the leaders know that, I think, more than their citizens do. And so you could make the argument that they're just being responsible, that they can't just go and tell Trump to screw off because they know the damage that can cause. But here's the problem with that. That's what they've been doing over the past year. And what has it gotten us? I mean, the EU signed a surrender deal with the United States, promising to fork over $1.35 trillion in energy and other payments, agreeing to pay an illegal 15% tariff rate. Implicitly agreeing not to put on a digital services tax, to adjust EU climate legislation. And for what? Trump keeps threatening tariffs higher than 15%. He's clearly not living up to his end of the deal. He's threatened to militarily invade an EU member state. It is crazy, I think, that
Greenland is not a member state, but again,
the territory of
territory
a
of a member state. Yeah.
So we can see that pragmatic approach hasn't yielded results. Who fared the best out of this past year? Europe or Brazil, India, and China? Brazil, India, and China, because they stood up to Trump, because they refused to play his game, and then Trump just kind of left them alone. What we saw is Europe kind of displaying its hindquarters like an animal displaying its weakness, only invited more aggression from Donald Trump. Because he saw an easy mark, he saw an easy win. I think that's clearly why he thought he could get away with the Greenland stuff, which he didn't end up getting away with, because Europe finally stood up. But the pragmatic approach has only yielded more aggression. And so if the pragmatic approach is saying we can't anger the Americans in any way, we can't be aggressive with them, we can't stand up to them because then they're going to hurt us, but they're still hurting them. And so if instead Europe had a strategy of saying, we want to preserve this relationship, we are not trying to blow this up, but if you insist on blowing this up, here's what we're going to do. To task the Commission to prepare the anti-coercion instrument to be dropped at the moment's notice.
Say a few words more about that, what it is.
Yeah, so the anti-coercion instrument is something that was actually prepared with the intention to use it against China. It is to punish a country for trying to use trade to coerce the European Union into doing something. Now, it is clearly appropriate for use against the United States, given that by the very definition of what the United States is doing, they are trying to use trade to coerce the Europe to do something, in this case, to giving up territory, which is the most extreme way you could use economic coercion. The problem is that originally, when Donald Trump had his Liberation Day tariff threat on the EU, the French were saying we need to not activate, to prepare the anti-coercion instrument. President von der Leyen refused. Chancellor Merz refused. So then they surrendered in July. So now again, with the Greenland threats, the French were again saying, we need to task the Commission with preparing the anti-coercion instrument. From the German government, we got very confusing signals. The finance minister was saying, yes, let's prepare it. Merz seemed to be walking that back. In any event, by the time they had that emergency summit last Thursday, it was already Donald Trump had retreated at Davos. So we were in this weird situation, still having that summit here, which I thought was an incredibly embarrassing spectacle for the European Union. Luckily, it didn't get much media attention, how embarrassing that was. But they then didn't task the Commission to prepare the anti-coercion instrument because they didn't want to make Trump change his mind. So all the leaders were forced to come here to Brussels, say really nice things about the US and leave because they were scared. No one did a final press conference except Pedro Sanchez. I don't understand why you wouldn't just tell the Commission, look, based on what the behavior of the United States over the past weeks, we're relieved that they've backed off, but we clearly need to prepare this. Not activate it, but prepare it. So that's something they can do. There's lots of things they can do, which would be pragmatic to prepare these things. But the EU is not going to launch the first strike here. We are, in a way, talking about mutually assured economic destruction. Europe is never going to be the one that will launch that economic nuclear missile. But if an economic nuclear missile is launched our way from the United States, if we're not prepared to respond to that, the blame is at the European leaders who could have prepared, but they have been too scared to even prepare these things for fear of angering Donald Trump.
And that's exactly what I want to come back to, because everything you just described through this very specific example shows the fragmentation, that you have differences between France and Germany, you have Spain thinks one way or Poland thinks another way, and so there's a lot of different views on the very same matter. So with such fragmentation, even if Europe pulls this off and says, okay, here's the strategy, how to become the strategic autonomy, how to be a truly independent or let's say self-sufficient continent, and again, the term between continent and European Union, not necessarily the same. But this is the direction where we're going to go, and here are the 247 steps that we need to take to get there in economic, in payment systems, in military terms, in procurement, in everything that we discussed and beyond. And yet, Europe doesn't look at it, or the European Union doesn't look at itself as such a power. It's an economic powerhouse, but it doesn't look at it. The self-image is very far away from that. So there's one side is the fragmentation, but the other one is the self-image, that we don't look at ourselves as an empire, not a good word, but something, again, as a powerhouse, right? As a unique, united power. And even if we are, let's say, the good guys, or at least we want to look at ourselves as the good guys in the global story, where we're not going to launch those aggressive measures, be military, economic, or other, still we want to have a fortress that we can defend. And again, we're not talking immigration as a fortress where it's often compared, but fortress as again, self-sufficient union. So the self-image is different. We are fragmented. Enormous pressure from the outside, and not just the US, but you have China, and then you have Middle Eastern powers trying to do a lot of sabotage and different influence operations here. What then? How realistic is all of that?
Well, that's precisely the reason why the last recommendation in that final section of the book is that we need to make Europeans believe in themselves, because without that, none of this is impossible. None of this is possible, and we might as well just give up and go home. Europeans have a real self-confidence problem. It's the number one thing I've noticed actually moving from the United States. I would say Americans are overconfident. I would like to take half of the confidence of the average American and give it to the average European. It's interesting, I tell the story in the book in the context of a visit with my distant relatives in Italy. I heard the idea that Europeans are the descendants of people who were too lazy and cowardly to leave, and that Americans are the descendants of Europeans who had the ambition, the drive, whatever, to get on a boat and cross an ocean. I don't think that's true, because it doesn't make any sense. You don't pass those values down, I think, over multiple generations. I think actually European timidity has more to do with the experience of World War II. The trauma of World War II, followed by the American occupation and the subsequent American dependence. The occupation of Germany and Italy. And the subsequent dependence through the Marshall Plan, that it gave Europeans, they kind of associate that American dependence with peace, and they associate the lack of that dependence with war. and chaos. And I think that's a lot where the timidity comes from, rather than this being a century of like centuries old things that are passed on through generations. I also think it's an education system problem. I really, I didn't go through the European education system. I was educated in the United States, but when my European friends tell me about their experience in school, it is so different from mine, like night and day difference. It is so much more about testing, about rote learning, about memorization. And my experience was much more about expressing opinions, class participation, essay writing. I had very few tests, actually, in my education system. And, I don't have hugely nice things to say about the American education system, particularly the university system. I think it's a Ponzi scheme, but that's another topic. But one thing I can say about it is it does give Americans the ability to think creatively and to believe in ourselves, and maybe believe in ourselves too much, maybe talk nonsense when we don't actually know what we're talking about sometimes. But I'd rather Europeans get a little more bold in getting ahead of themselves and talking more self-believingly. Maybe even if they were to get something wrong, just say it. Because the timidity on this continent, I think, holds everything back.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point, and I appreciate that you put that in the book, because it's not really looked at, and we, and I say it as a European, needed an Italian, Belgian, American to come and open our eyes to that, where that self-confidence is just vital. Because again, indeed, just like you say, whether it's a business or perhaps even in politics or product services, when you say, well, this is European, what's the connotation? What's the self-image? What's the secondary message that comes through? Now, slightly changing the conversation, but again, sticking to all of this. As I was reading your book, a big question came up. And the big question is, suppose whatever you outlined here works. It's successful. There's a United States of Europe. There's a federal Europe. There's unity, whether it's 27 countries or fewer, because more are on board, call them the coalition of the willing in another setting, or many more, because you take Western Balkans. Never mind. There is a united Europe. And my question is, it can very easily be hijacked, because when you have a federal system and someone with political views and agendas as determined as the Trump administration or some others come along, well, they can use a unified system to move it into a direction that would be very different from where you would like to head. So what I'm saying is, fragmentation exposes you, and you can be eaten up by the larger powers. But when you have a united system, there's an internal danger where someone rises to powers and takes it to another direction. I mean, again, on a minuscule scale, or not so minuscule, but on a much smaller scale, you have Hungary and Orban. Orban basically cannibalized Hungarian institutions and everything else, and it's the projection of his will. That's what the country is. Government and party and everything else is under his rule.
And you see that Urbanization of society happening in the United States right now. That's why.
So again, how do you reconcile that, of not to have a system being exposed to that internal hijacking?
Well, that's why Europe has to learn the lessons of the United States. You do not want to recreate the United States here in Europe, and that's certainly not what I'm advocating for. The United States is a democratic experiment that's gone very, very wrong, and that's because of the development of what we call the imperial presidency. And that's something that developed over many decades, particularly after World War II, that the White House started accruing more and more power that it was never intended to have under the original Constitution. State governments became progressively less and less powerful, but also less and less paid attention to, because local media started dying. So even our local newscasts in the US, they don't cover the state governments, even though state governments make something like 40% of the laws that impact the average person. Everyone is only focused on the power center, which is the national government. That is not the way that the United States was supposed to be. It's something that's gone horribly wrong, and Europe should learn the lessons of what went wrong there. And so everything in the design of a federal or confederal Europe should be to avoid becoming like the United States. You want significant power to remain with the member states. In the same way, I think that the US Constitution originally envisaged. You would want to make sure that if we had a president of Europe, which I think we should have, it's interesting, Sophie Intervelt, the former Dutch MEP, was on the panel of my book launch, and I think the only thing we disagreed on there is that she really thinks that a president of Europe is a very bad idea because it's not in the European tradition to have an executive presidency, other than France. But I think you need the citizens to be able to directly elect someone who can take on the national governments. Otherwise, the executive can't ever have real power unless they have that democratic legitimacy of having been elected. It's true that that could go very wrong, and it's the number one reason that people give when you say, let's have a directly elected commission president or EU president, if you combine both the positions. People say, but what if the population, people think, you can see what happens with the European Parliament votes. People treat it as a throwaway vote to register their discontent with whatever. And so you could easily get the majority of Europeans electing a far-right crazy person, and then you're really in trouble. I think that, you could design the system to lessen the risk of that, for instance, by having only candidates from parties specific, have it harder for like a random person to get in there. But also you would want to majorly limit the power of that president. I am certainly not advocating for the EU to have a president that would resemble the power of the US presidency today. That is everything that's wrong with the United States. And we need to do it a European way. It's actually why I generally avoid the term United States of Europe. I think the only time I use it in the book is when I'm referring to the title of that 2004 book that I read. I don't like using it, I think, because it turns people off. I think it sounds like you're trying to say that...
Emulate the US.
Yeah, emulate the US. Because I think, obviously, Europe is an entirely different situation than the United States. I actually usually say India would serve as a better example for a federal Europe than the United States, because India is also a union, a multi-ethnic union, multilingual union that took different nations with hundreds of years of separate history and brought them together for the purpose of making one powerful federation. I wrote a Substack post about this last week while the EU and the US EU and India were signing their trade deal. Yeah. I think that makes more sense. There's all kinds of things that are not replicable here in Europe for the United States. But also, the number one thing is you don't want to have happen here what happened in the United States, because look what happened. Look where it got them. US governance structures are totally broken. And in Europe, as we design this project, and that's my favorite thing about Europe, it's the thing that motivated me to come here. When the US seemed so old and archaic, the EU seemed like a young, dynamic project in creation that really appealed to me. So as we create this project, let's think about how to do it in a European way, and let's think about how to avoid the mistakes that we've seen in the United States, and hey, the mistakes that we've seen in India as well.
India is a very interesting one. I never thought about seeing that parallel in political terms. And honestly, I know next to nothing about how the Indian federal, I don't even know if it's called federal, but how the government structure is built up.
The parallels are really significant. It's so much so that there are 22 official languages in India, just one less than in the EU.
Whoa, impressive. I think currently we have 24 because I think, Gaelic, Irish has a special...
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's
kind of in and out.
Yeah,
it's a special
one,
taste,
yeah.
but that's just a minor thing. But what I was going to say is, let me again take the counterfactual and look at, I use the word hijacked, but it's not hijacked because there's popular vote in the US and the president has been elected through the right procedures. And that's the popular demand. Now, his popularity, where it is, that's a separate story since the election and whatever he's done. But again, if that's what people want, that's what people get. And there is that direct legitimacy through the electorate and through the constitutional processes, but it went through the right process. It's legitimate. Also, you look at the US economy, it's very strong. It's extremely solid. And if you compare it to the European economy, I mean, there's a massive, massive gap. If you think back the time when you came here, it was head-to-head, sort of,
On
around that
nominal
time,
GDP.
right? And now there's a massive gap of how much American companies are innovating. You look at all the AI companies, you look at all the, again, foundational technologies, and not just things that are built on top that many Europeans use, but the foundational things are there. So it's extremely advanced when you look at the macroeconomic terms, the innovation capacity, the funding, the startup world, the venture capital, all the other metrics. So if you look at it from that angle, it's extremely successful, whereas Europe is definitely not in comparison to those metrics. So how do you see this contradiction?
So on the first point, I would say that the problem in this respect is not Donald Trump himself. It's the power of the presidency. It's that the presidency became such a powerful institution that there are no checks and balances anymore. The Congress is nothing now. We basically don't have one. So that the problem is really that the structures failed. Yes, Donald Trump was legitimately elected, and that says something very frightening about the American people. They did choose for him to go there. This was not a coup. But the fact that he has been able to change so much about the fabric of the whole country in 1 year, that should not be. It should not be that one person has that much power. And that's my point about you should never develop a presidency in Europe that could ever have anything like the amount of power that the presidency has in the US. On the other point, it's really, yes, it's true that Europe has not innovated in the way that the United States has. But it's important to point out that comparison between 2008, when we were at the high level mark, is for nominal GDP. But if you're looking at purchasing power parity for GDP, the EU is still roughly equal to the United States.
No, it was doing well at the time, even on PPP basis. What I'm saying is
but
compared to now.
But we're equal on PPP now. What we're not equal on is nominal GDP. And there's lots of economists who would argue that nominal GDP is a metric that's biased for the United States, that's always going to make the United States look better than it is. One of the reasons is because we here in Europe give the United States the ability to take on unlimited debt because of the dollar as the reserve currency. Right. That's just one instance of how this works. The whole deck is stacked against us and for the United States, particularly when you're talking about metrics. Because also, look at an average person's life in the United States. I mean, there is no guaranteed minimum holiday time. Most of my friends and family have 5 days vacation per year. There's no guaranteed health insurance. They have to scrounge around. They spend all of this money. My last job in the United States before I left, I had health care through my employer, and I still had to pay $500 a month as a copay. So when people stack up, when they look at American salaries versus European salaries, it's going to look like Americans are much wealthier. But they're not, because in addition to those salaries, they have to pay all of these costs that Europeans don't have. They have to pay for healthcare. They have to pay for education. $40,000 a year is what I paid. I think it's $60,000 a year now. There's all kinds of expenses that are in there. If you look at quality of life, I mean, it's no comparison. Quality of life in Europe is infinitely better than in the United States. So, when I think about my working class family where I come from, how are they benefiting from the U.S. having this great nominal GDP at the moment? I mean, my sister-in-law had to go immediately back to work after she had twin babies. They gave her 2 weeks of maternity leave.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what person would want to live there? But I think, there's this mythology around the United States, both within it and here. We're taught, Europeans are taught, that the U.S. is this great place to live and that everyone should aspire to move there to have the American dream. They even enter this perverse green card lottery that I talk about in the book, which it's crazy to me that anyone in Europe would think it's a prize to live in the United States. So all I would say
I have
with
a friend
that
who
is,
actually won that lottery.
I know a lot of people who won it and went and had a very disappointing experience. Because when they got there, they found it's not quite as gilded as they're taught to believe here. But I think the larger point is, yes, Americans innovate more than Europeans. Yes, the most successful companies are American and not European. There's many reasons for that, which the Draghi report goes into. I personally don't think the reasons are EU bureaucracy. The problem, as Draghi laid out, is the failure to complete the single market, that this is not a real single market here in Europe yet, and the United States is a real single market. And the barriers are national. All that red tape that people complain about, that's a national problem, not an EU problem. So I think the solutions that the EPP is, for instance, throwing out there right now are not really reading the Draghi report in an honest way, let me say.
Yeah.
Because the excerpts that von der Leyen and the EPP like to pull out from the Draghi reports are carefully chosen, I would say. And there's parts of that report that they don't like to talk about. But the larger point is just there's so much to be proud of in terms of the European economy. And yes, we need European champions. We need unicorns. We need to fix early stage seed funding, which I talk about in the book. There's lots of problems we need to overcome here. But anyone would be luckier to live in Europe than the United States. I can say that because I'm from there. I see how my family and friends live there. I see how my friends live here, and I know the difference.
I think it's a very important point. Very well, fair point, because the quality of life here is good, and that's my next pushback, or let's say ball that I'm throwing up and seeing what you do with it is. Some would say, well, Europe has been living too well, and Europe is borderline socialist in the sense that you don't need to work much, but you get a lot of benefits. You get a lot of whether it's unemployment benefit, whether it's holidays, whether it's any other ways that the state supports you. So it's a great idea, but it's been pushed too far, and it's been pushed to the brink where it hurts competitiveness. We are losing out. Now, where we are, essentially, there's war in Europe because of Ukraine, and who knows what else it might develop into. We can't afford anymore. We can't afford to give out all these payments. We need to pay that, spend it partly on military, partly on other things. So the way of life that we are so used to now is unsustainable. What do you say for that?
I 100% agree with that. You know, there is a European way of life, as the Commission likes to put it, that we should absolutely preserve here. And that includes a social safety net. That includes not leaving people to die on the streets like happens in other countries. However, I live in Belgium, and I can see how much these systems have come to be abused, these social welfare systems. The fact that I pay the highest tax in the world here, and I can see where my tax money is going, whole segments of the population that just don't work. I think we need to talk honestly about that. And, you know, I think there is a temptation, if you're somebody that comes from the left, that you can't acknowledge some of these things that we can all see. There are definitely broken social welfare systems that have come to be abused intensely. Like, there's a whole industry of abusing these things. The whole burnout leave that we have here in Belgium, which is like a whole system of doctors just getting people off work because they don't feel like working. We need to fix that. But again, I would say those problems are at national level. I mean, you hear, you know, J.D. Vance and all these Americans coming in and saying, oh, the EU is a socialist project that is welfare states throwing money away, blah, blah. These problems are not EU problems. This is a Belgian problem. This is a France problem. This is something that's been allowed to develop because safeguards were not in place in social welfare systems, which had the best of intentions when they were developed. But we've seen that over time they've come to be majorly abused. And we have to tackle that here in Europe. Yes, it is a European liability. It's a huge European problem. But we can't listen to these right-wing ideologues who are saying that it is an EU-created problem. It has absolutely nothing to do with the EU. These social welfare systems are national competences. Maybe we can get the EU to solve them, but the EU, we don't need the EU to solve them because the EU created them. But when you listen even to these center-right politicians here in Europe, you would think that the EU invented these social welfare systems that are now being abused, which is just not the case.
Yeah. So talking about Vice President J.D. Vance, two easy topics. I'll just say two words here: immigration, free speech, which are often on his mind, and they would talk a lot about that. How do you see that being an issue here in Europe?
The free speech thing is a complete red herring. It's crazy. They just are making things up about in Germany you can get arrested for a mean tweet. It's complete fake news. There is no basis in truth for what they're saying about free speech limitations in Europe.
And UK still?
And what they're saying about the UK, I would also say no basis in truth. There are some countries, because of their history, that have particularly strong free speech rules. Germany is one of them, where you can't brandish a swastika. There's lots of things that are forbidden as speech. That is because of Germany's particular history. I'm not sure that those restrictions are healthy now, 80 years later. I think maybe they cause more harm than good. That's for Germany to sort. But I think generally in Europe, we do not have major restrictions on free speech. And for the US vice president to be saying that while they are arresting journalists, Don Lemon just being arrested 2 days before we're speaking, while they're shooting people, summarily executing them in the street because of speech, while they're shutting down media organizations, while they're buying them out because they don't like what they're saying. I just think we in Europe cannot take that free speech thing seriously at all. It is a complete red herring. It's absurd, and we should tell them to F off as soon as they start bringing it up. Now, immigration. Immigration here in Europe is not a feel-good story. We have to be honest about that. The way this has been handled over the past decades by governments has not been good. We've created parallel societies. We've created ghettos where people are discriminated against, and they don't feel like they have opportunities. And so then they turn to, in the most extreme cases, as we've seen over the past years, terrorism, but also petty crime. You can see the racial statistics for prison populations in Europe, not something for Europe to be proud of, to the extent that we can even collect racial statistics because it's not allowed to even have that statistic in Belgium or France.
Yeah.
This is a failure. The failure to integrate the immigrants that have come here to Europe over the past 40 years is a failure by governments, not by the immigrants themselves. This isn't their fault. This is the government's fault. And the biggest problem is that nobody in Europe wants to talk about it. This has been one of my biggest disappointments with Europe since I've arrived here, that this is an intensely racist continent. I just have to be honest about that.
Really?
Yes, much more than the United States. I've been shocked over the years by the things that people will say here just casually in polite dinner conversation, that if you said that in the United States, at least in the Northeast where I come from, you would be asked to leave. I've been shocked.
Is it Belgium that where
So
you had this
I
experience?
would definitely say Belgium. So I would say in continental Europe, this is more pronounced than in the UK. I think when I lived in the UK, I felt like the discourse around race was familiar to me as an American. It was not so shocking. It was really when I moved to continental Europe, Germany, France, Belgium, and heard the way that people talk about immigrant populations here. Was quite shocking to me. But the biggest shock and frustration is that Europeans think of racism as being an American phenomenon. Why? Because American movies and television examine this topic intensely, right? And those cultural productions are then exported to Europe. In Europe, Europeans don't examine this topic. They don't like to talk about immigration, racism, the discrimination that minority populations experience here in Europe. And so then you would just think it doesn't happen because it's not examined. And in the European mind, racism is an American problem and not a European problem. And I give one example in the book. Back during the George Floyd protests, this was during Corona times.
Yeah, 2020.
This would have been
right?
2020, right?
2020, yeah.
I had a tweet thread. Was it still Twitter then? Yes, I think it was still Twitter. So I had a tweet thread when a bunch of Belgian people came out onto the streets and were protesting in solidarity for the George Floyd protests. And I said, that's great. However, I really wonder why none of you turned out when there was a protest for a young Moroccan man who was killed while fleeing police just 2 weeks earlier. I live in the city center, so I saw those protests, and I could see the ethnic makeup of the people who were protesting, and I can tell you there weren't white Belgians out there on the streets in solidarity with their fellow Belgian who had been killed. But yet when something happens in the United States, everybody wanted to jump on the bandwagon. And I attribute that actually to this cultural domination, that what happens in America is so intensely examined here in Europe that Europeans miss the things that are happening in their own backyard. It doesn't even occur to them that there may be systemic racism in the way that Belgian police police the neighborhoods here in Brussels, like Molenbeek, like Schaerbeek, like Anderlecht. That it doesn't even enter into their minds. And that has been hugely frustrating to me. So on the subject of immigration, yeah, I think we need to have that conversation here. I would say ignore what J.D. Vance says about free speech. And certainly the motivations of MAGA when they're talking about immigration are gross. They're white nationalistic. They think the society should be like purely white. So Europeans, unfortunately, in my experience, I think there's a lot of people here in Europe for whom these arguments are appealing. We need to really guard against that. And I think we need to have an honest conversation that the integration situation has not gone well. Government needs to do something about that. But also, Europe needs migration. Given the way birth rates are, the European economy will collapse without it. We need it, but let's do it smartly. Let's do it in a thought-out way, because the way that European governments handled this, having these guest worker programs in the 60s and 70s where they just assumed people would leave after, and then when they didn't really have any plan of, okay, let's welcome them, let's have a plan for integrating them into society. That's the problem, and it deserves examination, I think.
Until the humanoid robots take over.
Right.
Which are immigrants of a certain sort, but kind of homegrown. But with that, maybe one or two final questions before we wrap. One is, would you, let me put this a little provocatively, would you agree with that sentiment that many Europeans not love to hate the US, but love to point their fingers at the US and feel superior and say, well, we are better educated, we know more about the world, we live better here. So there is this very weird relation where on one side they admire the US and on the other side they love to look down on the US. How do you see that?
Yeah, completely. This is, I get this reaction a lot on social media, particularly Blue Sky, which is its own weird little ecosystem. But when I say, Europeans are dependent on the US, Europeans are obsessed with the US, then I get this response, no, what are you talking about? All Europeans hate America. You're stupid. What they're thinking of is this kind of smug Blue Sky crowd who wants to point at the average American as so stupid. Oh, they don't know geography. They're dumb. Whatever. This dumb American stereotype.
Yeah, show me Wisconsin on a blind map, right?
Yeah. Which that stereotype doesn't come from nowhere. A lot of Americans are pretty stupid. But where all these people say that, I want to ask them, okay, so why are you allowing such stupid people to run your life? Why are you so content to have these people that you think are so dumb control your day-to-day experience, your governance? Why are you watching all of these American movies? I mean, the reason that you have this impression of Americans being so dumb is because you watch them constantly, because you're obsessed with them. So that's the response I would have to people who say that. I would also say that in my experience, this is a particular type of European that likes to do this. This is a wealthier, well-educated European that likes to snarkily point to the US about how dumb they are, particularly in the UK. However, working-class Europeans don't do this. I'd like to think that I have a broad swathe of friends and acquaintances here in Europe, and I would say this is something that educated Europeans like to engage in. But when we're talking about people who only have secondary school level education, I don't see this, Americans are so dumb type stuff. I see a lot of adoration. I see a kind of worshipful attitude. And that is the majority of people in the end.
That reminds me one thing. I wanted to start a conversation with this, but but I'm only reminded to say it now. So my brother-in-law's friend, anyways, they were in the Netherlands and they were studying, and the guy had to make a presentation about a country, and he picked the U.S. A Canadian guy, but in any case, he had to make a presentation about the U.S. So he stands there with a very dramatic look at the classroom and everyone else, and he says, "America, freedom and hamburgers." And and those two words really struck me because I think there's so much in it. And the reason I remembered it is the hamburger part, where the food is a very interesting part of that, right? Like there are so many American food joints and chains, and the McDonald's and the Burger Kings and the others. Even though here we have our local version named Quick. But what I'm saying is that, let's say on the broad and very wide part of a pyramid, of a social pyramid, of a cultural pyramid, of a food pyramid, so to say, American products and services and everything is very accessible, right? Like it caters to a very broad layer of society. And I think that kind of points to many things that we spoke about, that somehow there's this understanding of how to create those services and products that have a very wide appeal. And here in Europe, it's much less.
And
Really
the cuisine that has had that effect only had it because it bounced back off of America. If you think about Italian cuisine, very basic, very accessible. Why? Because we're not eating Italian cuisine, we're eating Italian-American cuisine. I mean,
Pizza
some of
Hut,
the classic
right?
things that you see on a menu at a restaurant, my Italian friends laugh at, because it's even at an Italian restaurant here in Belgium is an exception, I think, because we have a big Italian community. But let's say, an Italian restaurant in Germany, you're actually getting like what America thinks Italian food is. You get those red checkered tablecloths, which do not exist in Italy. Versus French cuisine, which is considered like very fancy and didn't bounce off of America. With that, you're getting like probably a real French cook there.
Yeah.
But it's same with Chinese cuisine. America has taken a lot of cuisines. Mexican cuisine. The versions of that we're getting here in Europe are actually the Americanized versions, not the direct export from the country in question, which again just speaks to this kind of cultural dominance, that even the things that we might think that we're eating because it's European, or we're experiencing because it's European, actually we're only getting because it boomeranged back from America.
Yeah. I think you quote my friend, and he was the first guest on the show, Sam Wilkin, who writes the book The Leopard. So where he says, okay, he needs to, for him to go viral, it had to go through the US, virtually speaking, to reach a broader European audience. So with that, maybe as a final question before we have the final one with the card. But the final question is, so you say how to free Europe from all these American assets and all those dependency factors. Are you optimistic? Are you realistic? Are you pragmatic? How do you see the likelihood of this succeeding, your blueprint of success?
I'm always hesitant to answer this honestly, because I'm not feeling very optimistic right now, if I'm honest. But I don't know. I still have hope. If we didn't have hope, what could we do? I mean, the tools are all there. It's all possible. This isn't pie in the sky stuff. Europe has the potential. It has the population, and people here are very talented and very smart and do have the ambition there somewhere. It's just that we have to change the way of thinking. I don't think I could sit here and tell you I'm feeling optimistic right now, but I want to be optimistic. I so desperately want to be optimistic. And so I would say we have every reason to think that we can achieve what I outline in the book. We just need a change in mentality. And part of that change in mentality is to be more optimistic here in Europe and to stop having such a defeatist attitude, which is why my instinct is not to acknowledge my own defeatist attitude, but to say, I have great confidence in Europe, and yes, we're going to do this. But if I'm honest, it's hard these days. It's hard to have optimism.
And that is something I definitely take away from the book and also our conversation. And I really appreciate you putting it in there and identifying it to say, hey, the mindset is the number one. That's what gets you started with the famous American can-do attitude. In Europe, we need something like the yes, we are able to, the yes, we can do it kind of attitude and then of course doing all the necessary steps. But whether I'm optimistic or not, yeah, I'm very skeptical, unfortunately. I wish I wasn't, but anyways, we'll have this conversation hopefully in a couple of years again and see where we are. Until then, we have our card. So if you could pull one.
Okay, at random.
Yeah, whichever. Just read it out and answer.
So, when did you last feel desperate? I would say the night of Donald Trump's election in 2016. I was in Berlin at that time. I was on a panel on Deutsche Welle, and we were analyzing the election results as they came in the middle of the night. The U.S. election results. It was like 3 a.m, and then when it finally became apparent that he had won, it was
Trump.
Yeah, Trump had won. It was clearly something no one was expecting. Even I think I read about this in the book. Even the young guy that they had brought on to be in the panel to be like the Trump advocate, even he seemed surprised. And I got done with that shift, and they paid for the car service home, and I was taking the car back to my apartment in Berlin and just thought, what now? I mean, I didn't see it coming, actually. And I felt desperate and hopeless in that moment. Like I just couldn't, I almost couldn't comprehend or make sense of how much the world had just changed in that moment. And I realized nothing would be the same after that.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that feeling that when you realize that, okay, something has changed. Yeah. There's something not just in the air, but the world has changed course and we haven't necessarily noticed that it has. Well, with those optimistic and happy words, sir, thank you so much for coming on a podcast. Wishing you lots of luck with the book.
Great. Thank you so much. And it was great to talk to you about it.
Wonderful.